Thank you for joining me in part 2 of this podcast. I've been speaking to my siblings about our different experiences having grieved the loss of their brother-in-law and my husband. We've talked about how critical our relationships with one another have been in helping us to be there for each other when this terrible time did come.
There was a conference talk some years ago where the speaker was talking about the atonement, and he said that nothing is wasted in the atonement. And he was referring to the fact of, who better to comfort and counsel someone who's been through alcoholism than someone who's been an alcoholic? Who better to comfort someone who lost a child than someone who's actually lost a child? And so I wanted to ask you, Julie, I was just curious, how have you changed the way that you actually help other people? Because it's been a couple of years, so you've obviously had a chance to come across someone who's had a loss or talk with someone. I was just curious how you approach it differently now that you've experienced it yourself.
So I don't think my experience is typical, actually, because my awareness of this goes back to when I met Steve. And because of what Steve had been through, Steve already had a hyper awareness for certain things. When somebody experienced the death, he's the one who taught me what to do. He taught me that it's okay to show up right away. He taught me that it's okay to be to ask people directly, how are you managing? That people want to talk about the person they lost. So it's okay to share memories about the person. I really think all of this, well, not all of it, most of it has not changed because it's things I've been doing for over 25 years. One of the things that Steve was always good about was he used to say, everybody comes to the rescue for the first few days or weeks, but then they kind of move on with their lives. So when you really, really need to reach out to somebody is after it's been a month and people have kind of resumed their normal activities. So that's something that I think he and I tried to be good about. But the way things have changed is that it's so much more intimate of an experience than it was before. We talked a lot, and so I knew a lot. Actually, one of the things that was interesting for me was as I went through these experiences or phases, I would think, oh, Steve told me about this. It was so interesting because it was something I'd already heard about. And so it was kind of strange I wasn't surprised by anything. But to speak to that, I think because I had had so much time and experience with understanding and learning what Steve had learned, that's probably why I was able to be more open about what I needed, or why I was able to reach out when I needed something. That was something that I definitely recognize as unique. I almost have never waited for somebody to come and offer their assistance. I'm pretty bold about, well, here's an example. And maybe this didn't answer your question, other than I'm very aware of those who have experienced loss, and I try to reach out to them right away and to be available to them, even a month later, 6 months later, a year later. I put the anniversaries of somebody's passing in my phone as an alert so that I can make sure that I call someone and say, how are you managing today? Because there's just no way for me to remember or, keep track of people like that. So I actually will put in my phone reminders to reach out to certain people so that I don't move on with my life so much that I have also kind of left them behind. But one of the things that was most important for me was so it was amazing. When Steve passed away, it was very, very early in the morning, like around 1:30 in the morning. And by 9 o'clock, my youngest daughter was already there. She'd been able to get on like a 5 o'clock flight. Shelley was there right away. Seth, I think you were there by the end of that day. I mean, everybody just flooding in. Ben came all the way from Norway. He was able to get there the next day. It was just amazing how quickly everybody came and was there supporting me. And then my children, a few of my children who were still, college age, were able to stay with me all summer, which was amazing. I was so grateful. And then I went and spent some time with Ben and Dasha in Norway and with their new baby, which was really, really wonderful. But then I got back about August. So Steve passed away in May. By August, it was just me in my house by myself. And it was the first time that I had really ever been by myself. I mean, I have siblings. I've shared a room my whole entire life, through college. And it was so strange to sleep alone. And I think the thing that I noticed then was just the deafening silence of going to sleep at night without even being able to turn and say, good night, love ya. Or to wake up in the morning and it's just me again and the dog. I mean, at least I had a dog. We would sleep with our butts to each other, so I was grateful to at least have a living being in the house, but I was not prepared for how crushingly lonely it was going to be to simply turn the light off and go to bed. And so I thought about that, and I didn't want to do that anymore. And so I remember reaching out to you guys, and I said, would you guys be willing to maybe tuck me in at night? To take one night of the week.
Took turns.
Yeah.
And you know Wednesday.
What? Yeah, that's right.
Mine was Monday.
Tuesday.
Yeah. But like you said earlier, Julie, I think that's one of the coolest things about our relationship as siblings is we all love each other, we all get along, and I can't imagine how awful it would have been if you didn't have, right? We all just took turns. We all just took one night, and sometimes Julie wanted to talk, sometimes she wanted advice, sometimes she wanted to gripe, and I remember one time she said to me, which really struck me. She was sometimes I just want to talk to a guy. I just want to talk to a man, and I remember thinking about that, going, yeah, because sometimes you just want to talk to a girl, and just how cool that must have been to just be able to just have all these different avenues that you can just vent on.
Right. And of course, you guys have always made me feel like that was no problem at all. I mean, you were so kind and generous, because I know that it's also, it's at night, right? It's the time when you're also, getting kids to bed, or you're also connecting with your spouse. And yet your kids, your spouses, they gave such grace to say, here, you go spend this time with your sister who needs you. I'm so grateful for that.
We did that for like a year, right? I mean, it was basically your transition from Steve's passing to meeting Michael. I mean, we did that for, I think it was over a year, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I think for me, I don't know if anyone else experienced this, but not only did my relationship with Julie improve, my relationship with the rest of you also improved, because Tuesdays was me talking to Julie and just getting her day and getting her thoughts. And then I would gossip with Shelley or Seth or Aaron and like, hey, this is, this is what Julie, told me, or, how are you doing with this? Because talking to Julie made me realize that you've got your own issues too. And I think it helped us all, our interconnectedness strengthen, because yes, we were all rallying around Julie, but in doing so, we were also forming stronger bonds with each other.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's really cool.
Wasn't it about that at the same time also that, I mean, we have this massive sibling text thread that we just keep using and using and using. And sometimes it's serious and sometimes it's memes, but I don't think that's been around longer than about 3 years. It seems like this event and it
triggered that.
The tying together sort of put us all on a sibling thread that we haven't really stopped. And that's been a real, unexpected blessing out of it.
And it was started at Shelley's request because she was tired of having 6 different conversations explaining how Julie was doing.
Because Shelley gets tired of being the hub all the time.
I will tell you, though, one thing that fundamentally changed me from this whole experience, talk about when we all took a night and talked to you. You probably don't remember this, but one of the nights you were really, really venting on me. You weren't mad at anybody in particular, but you were talking about the air filter in the house. Did you by chance remember that conversation?
Yes, the air filter.
You were so furious because you didn't know how to change the air filter. You didn't know what kind of air filter you did. And so you started naming off all these little like honeydews, right? Things that just normally need to happen around a house. Oh, some spackle needs to be put here. This needs to be raked. And you made a comment to the fact of saying something like, I wish that I just had somebody that I could just call, my home teacher or something, and they would just regularly just come and do these things. And it sparked a thought in me. And so what I actually did was I actually reached out to all the widows in the ward. And I actually went over and I said, I want you to give me a list of all the honeydews that you need done in your house, from large projects to small projects. And then I had the youth set aside the 5th Tuesday of every month that was the service mutual. And so what the youth started doing in the elders quorum, they all had these lists of like 20 things from all these different widowers and divorced women. And they just started going through and just doing all these honeydew lists. And it was so cool to see the youth actually be able to help. But then it was interesting to me because when I first started talking to them, they really didn't want to tell me about their problems. They didn't want to tell me that this hinge needed to be fixed, or that, this whole, barn needed to be emptied and all this stuff needed to be thrown away. They felt like they were being a burden. So I had to kind of like coerce them. Look, I'm trying to look for service projects for the youth, right? That was the point behind it. But that the seed of that, and it's become this big, huge thing in our stake. And that really is from the seed of that experience happening. So I really do think, Julie, that really was the beginning of a really, really great idea because of something tragic that happened. And just this little vent, right? This little thing that you said became this huge, wonderful, cool thing.
I love that. Shelley,
I also want to piggyback a little bit. Well, you guys might not realize, you guys all had your nights up here because we're close. Friday night became Aunt Julie's sleepover night for my kids.
Yep.
Which was a huge win-win for us as well. But I think there was also a lot of healing for them because my kids in particular were really, really close to Steve, especially Mac. And so for the kids to be able to go over and just kind of be in his environment and see his things and support Julie, and also to teach them as youth that this is what you do. This is what you do for family. You go and you be there with them. And whether that's having fun or you're, having a serious conversation, but even as a kid, that you can still provide comfort. And they were able to do that. They were able to comfort Julie and give her someone to care for and just have some bodies in the house. But to teach them that that's what we do.
Yeah.
We are there. Even if all we're doing is just being physically present, that we are there.
And I think that's a big takeaway from this, Julie, is that, like you said earlier, I have from then on, I do not, when someone dies, I don't bring them a cake, right? I don't bring them cookies. I don't bring them chips and salsa. I wait a week, but it's also just a reminder that even after their spouse dies, they are just still going to need help. And it's so important to just constantly ask them, what can I do to help you? What can I do to help you?
Well, isn't that the whole foundation of Christ's teaching? I mean, he was always about doing good for the most vulnerable. And who's more vulnerable than a child who's lost a parent, or a spouse who's lost their companion, or, these are those moments. I remember thinking that it was interesting how Steve's passing brought out the best in most people, but in very few circumstances, I think it brought out the worst in a few people that had been close to him or close to us. And I remember thinking, these are the moments that your whole life is hinged on how you treat someone in the most vulnerable part of their life. And I think that's something really important to think about. So it's beyond just being aware, but really, when somebody is suffering, how do you respond to that? Do you actively make their suffering worse? That's the rare event, but it does happen. People choose that time to sometimes to go after things that they weren't able to resolve while the person was alive. Or do you put all that aside and just come together and love someone and support them?
Definitely not a time to rub salt in people's wounds and make it worse. I think one of the things that I've taken out of all this is that it is a very common feeling when someone passes away that you don't know what to say. You feel like you have to come up with something profound, something from the scriptures, something from a general conference talk, something wise that sort of smooths it all over. And because you don't know what to say, you don't say anything. And that's probably the greatest no-no, is don't be the person that just doesn't say anything, because that's just isolating. And just, one of the great lessons that I've taken out of all this is it's much more important for you just to be there than it is to figure out something that's going to make it all better, because it's not going to be all better.
So I just want to respond to the, what do you do, or how do you respond when somebody is negatively affected by a loss? And I would say that is also a form of grief, that it may not be love with nowhere to go. It's an unresolved angst or an unresolved issue, or something that they wanted to heal, didn't know how to heal, and it's the only expression that they have. I mean, it's true. Some people are just negative. But if somebody dies and somebody else comes along and says nothing but negative about them, that's something that they've held in. And honestly, just let them say it. I say just let them get it out, and you'll probably never have to ever deal with them again. But this is something that was bottled up. And now literally the person that they had animosity towards is not there to receive their unspoken ire. So let them vomit their poison and be on their way.
I find it really interesting, like after someone has something major happen to them, some kind of loss or anything like that you'll start to hear the peripheral of some people say things like, I wish they would just get over it, right? I wish they could just move on. And I find that kind of fascinating, because to me now, I look at that very different, because before I've always been kind of a logical thinker. And so my mind is always, look, this is reality, just deal with it and move on. But since this experience with you, Julie, it's really changed me in the sense that now when I hear people say that, it actually is a gauge to me on where I am on my Christ-like attitude, right? Because I mean, all right, I mean, but imagine Christ saying that to us, right? I mean, imagine if you were like in the middle of a prayer, and you're struggling with something, and literally just imagine if Christ just said, "I wish you would just get over it," right? I wish you'd just move on. I mean, how devastating would that be to your relationship with your Savior? And but yet we as people feel like we have the right to say that to other people, sometimes to their face, right? Sometimes we'll say, you just need to just move on, you just need to forget and just get over it. But it's important to remember that when people are in those stages, right, when they're down, that's the last thing they need is for anybody to be telling them how they should feel or how they should act. You know, and I would say one of the takeaways of the grieving process, especially for those who are trying to help, is to just be there in a very non-judgmental and just be what that person needs you to be, which was the cool thing about, again, going back to those little phone calls we're having. You had good days and bad days. And so in the bad days, you could vent. In the good days, you could talk. And we were all just there for you. And that's what you needed. And I think we'll all attest that it was really cool in this kind of like year and a half process is how I would bet that was probably the highlight of your day was waiting for that 6 p.m., right, where you could call somebody. But then I started to notice that after 6 or 9 months or a year, it didn't have to be every night. There were times where you would, you know, I'd call, you wouldn't answer, and you just text, say, I'm okay, I don't need anything. And that was probably just you weaning off of us, right? You getting back on your feet. But I think, but it didn't bother me at all, because to me that said, okay, she's right. She's doing okay. She's getting back on her feet. And I thought that was really cool just to watch that healing process for you from an observer point of view.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Jen.
Oh, so I was just while Seth was talking, it made me think about the ministering program of the church, that it is supposed to be so much easier. And when done right, it is that the whole point, ministering as the Savior would minister, is to do what they need at that time. And that's the same thing that we try to do when we're helping someone grieve. Is if they need to vent, we can be there for them to vent. If they need a hug, we can hug them. If they need a dinner, we can bring a dinner over. But that's really the whole point of trying to grieve well, is to have the Savior with you, and to because he's perfect in all things, which means he knows how to perfectly grieve. He's been through it. He's done it. He knows how to guide you through it. And when you seek after him as your companion, he's able to fill that void, or he brings the people that you need to help fill that void, to help, fix the hinge, to bring the dinner, whatever it is. And it blesses both people. The Lord is, Seth said, the Lord is not wasteful. He's perfectly efficient. He takes any situation, and it's almost like he says, watch what I can do with this. I've heard him say that to me before when I've been in difficult situations. Watch what I can do with this. And being able to see miraculous, beautiful things happen when we are making him our companion and our guide.
I think the last thought I want to share is that I've come to know that we all have a God-shaped hole in our heart. And when we find a companion, a person who is godly, they can almost perfectly fill that. But what we all actually need is the peace of God that's missing from us. And often it is almost full by another person, but they're godly. And so they have the almost shape of that God-shaped hole. And that's what we all need to feel the love, to feel complete, to feel unbroken. And, Heavenly Father always fills in every missing crack. But we all need that. And we need someone in our life. And if it's not a person, if it's not a companion, it's a sibling, it's a friend. We need that godly person that can come in and kind of be the patch for a little while to help us get to the next moment until God can come in and say, here is you complete. Here is that complete peace. You're okay now.
Thanks for sharing that. I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting you share that because, okay, if there was one thing that surprised me about my response after Steve passed away, I do believe because Steve was such a good person and we had such a good relationship, I had actually, to some degree, neglected my relationship with Christ because I found that without Steve there, I was almost having to reacquaint myself with Christ on a deeper level, a level I had been at before, but could now realize I had probably been putting a lot of my devotion into Steve, and I had to rebuild that relationship with Christ that I so desperately needed. So that's an interesting point you bring up. So before I ask my final question that I ask all of my guests, I just wanted to say it was interesting. I had this conversation with Seth, I guess. I remember saying to you and really feeling this, so that I know I'll be okay because I still have oil in my lamp. That was a really conscious thought. I was standing at this void. My life was devastated. The worst thing I could imagine happening had happened, and yet for a period of time, there was a really, really peaceful feeling in my home. Even though there was agony in me, there was also peace inside me, which may sound strange. But I remember thinking, I have a spiritual reserve here. So I'm going to be okay. I didn't know what that was going to look like, but I knew I was going to be okay. But then it's interesting, Seth, because what did you do with that?
I don't know if the other siblings know about this. So yeah, you had made that comment, and I thought it was a really, really beautiful comment. And so I called one of my friends who works for a graphics company, and I think I had Hannah, I believe, send me a bunch of your family pictures, digital versions of it. And I got a hold of a designer, and the designer actually did this whole collage. I believe the temple was the middle. I believe I don't exactly remember the picture, but we put all those pictures of your family and Steve all around, and then that was the motif, right? That was what that saying is. I'll be okay because there's still oil in my lamp.
Yeah, I hung that up and I looked at it, 50 times a day. I put it where I could see it all the time, and it was a mantra that really, really got me through on a daily basis. This idea that I will be okay because I have oil in my lamp, and I still believe that. And one of the things that I hope is that people listening will feel encouraged to build up those spiritual reserves so that when this inevitable hard thing in life happens, whatever that hard thing is, and we've had hard things, but there's always going to be a hard thing, that we don't crumple at it, it doesn't destroy us. And
which is an interesting thing about that parable, right? That they had to have the oil ahead of time. Because imagine if you weren't in a good place spiritually, right? If you just weren't being that great, and then this devastating thing happens, how much further down that rabbit hole you would have gone.
Oh yeah, it's hard enough as it is. Yeah. Well, my question for each of you, and you can take a turn. What do you believe it means to grieve well?
I'm gonna go back to what I shared earlier, that grief is love with nowhere to go. Grieving well, I think, means letting yourself feel what's happening, but also letting it pass through you. And I'm gonna say something that I think might be a little controversial, but bear with me. I think feelings can be poisonous. Any feeling, if we hold on to it too long, will affect the way we think, the way we see, the way we behave, the way we decide. Even positive feelings, people get addicted to fun and love and happiness. You need to have feelings, you need to experience them, but you need to understand that feelings are fleeting. They will pass, they do go away. And like being on a river, you just kind of have to go, you have to ride the river, but you still have a rudder. And you can take port when that river is no longer going in the direction you want to go, or when you need a break. So you need to let yourself feel, but you need to understand that it's going to pass, and you have to let it pass. But at whatever pace that means. Some people do get stuck, but a healthy grieving process is you have to feel the feeling for as long as it takes to feel, in order to feel satisfied. Okay, I felt that, and I don't need to dwell on this anymore. I'm ready to move on to the next one.
Thank you. Yeah. I don't think that's controversial at all. I think that's really profound.
I know some people are very attached to their feelings.
I find it to be kind of a hard question. I was actually up very, very early this morning, around 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, just thinking about things and taking some notes. And because even though this is really the first death that I've experienced that of someone that has been close to me, we had a cousin that passed away when we were younger. We had, Grandpa Potts that passed away. But this for me was the first real death that I've had to personally grieve. There's other things that have brought grief to my life, the whole infertility thing. And there are times when I have not grieved well, and I feel like the times when I have not grieved well, I've been kind of self-centered, and I've been focused more on my problems. And those are the times when I feel like I've had a harder time or a bigger struggle. But the times when I have felt like I'm grieving well are the times when I'm pointed outwards, that I'm trying to serve. I'm trying to look for other people that I can share my grief with, that I can allow them to mourn with me for whatever it is that we might be grieving. That I think that is really important, is to allow people in your life and to be able to share the burden, and be able to be willing to share someone else's burden. It's not easy, and it's not always comfortable, but there are great blessings to be had in that process of being able to share and to mourn together, to care together. Turning to the scriptures, turning to prayer, just being more aware of the people around you, being aware of your neighbors, being aware of the things that people are struggling with, can really help you to process, because it tunes you into your own feelings, the good feelings, not the bad feelings Adam talked about, but just being aware and using that and acting on that awareness, which is it's never convenient, but when you do, there are great blessings that can be had, and there's healing that can be obtained when you act upon that stuff.
I think that's true. Thanks for sharing that.
I think when I think about what does grieving well mean, to me, it's simply make it matter. make something out of it. Every experience we have, and I'm a big believer that sometimes we go through hard things because we then need to be prepared to help somebody else. And every hardship we go through, every struggle, every opportunity for grief is also opportunity to learn. And then when we have that understanding and we have that knowledge, it's then our job to be there for someone else. And so I think with anything, with any kind of grief, make it matter, because it's part of life. It's part of our learning process. And it's how we learn and grow and become more Christ-like, and then become more Christ-like in the sharing of how we went through it and how we were able to come closer to Christ, come closer to God, and understand what our purpose is. Our purpose is to be here, to strengthen each other, and to support each other. So I think, to me, very simply, it is just make it matter.
I think you've also, said some really, really beautiful things. One of my favorite sayings is that the agency that I demand Heavenly Father give me is the same agency that I demand Heavenly Father take away from everyone around me. And the reason I love that saying when it comes to grief is, I think when you have a death, I think that is the ultimate opportunity for you to practice either selfishness or selflessness. And because when someone has a death, everyone expects the person to be upset, and it's a very normal reaction for someone to say, Heavenly Father, how dare you take this person from me? How dare you make my life hard? How dare you do these things to me? But it doesn't happen super often. But when you have those opportunities where you do talk with someone, who's lost a child or a dog or a spouse or something happen, and you see them act totally differently. You see them be so concerned about other people. I remember during your funeral, Julie, it's probably all a blur to you. You probably don't remember. But I was super impressed with how concerned you were about everyone else in the room. You wanted to make sure that everyone else could get in the room, and you want to make sure that everyone else was comfortable. And that might have been a coping mechanism. That maybe is what it was. But it was still really beautiful, because in my opinion, that was Julie at her most raw, exposed point. That was really who Julie is at her core. And you were so concerned about other people, and it was really beautiful for me to watch that, and then to take that experience. So now, when I see people that are grieving, to be able to listen to the Holy Ghost and just try to be what they need at that time. And I think if during your grieving process, if you can try to think in terms of, what would Christ do, or what can I do to help someone else, I think it'll actually help your own grief.
I agree with you, but I still want to know, what do you think it means to grieve well?
I think shedding your agency, really, like all of you said before, letting God's will be done, and just accepting that whatever happens to you is either part of your growth or part of someone else's growth, and be completely accepting and have faith that He can do more with your life than you can yourself, and just let it run its course, let it happen.
Ben, what do you think it means to grieve well?
Ever since you asked me to be ready for this question, it's just one of those it's really personal. I think everybody does it differently, but if I were to put it into my best words, it's the process that I go through to accept the loss of my expectations. I mean, we spend so much time putting routines together, planning, what are we going to spend? How are we going to spend our time? The spiritual time that we spend with somebody, the investment, I guess that's the better word, the investment that we put into somebody, right? Mm-hmm. And especially if it's someone that gives back, and, we have this mutual reciprocal relationship. death is the end of that.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to come to terms with that loss, the loss that you expected so much more. Just briefly, I remember the last time I saw Steve.
Mm-hmm.
And this was at the end of a family reunion at the lake house 2 years before he passed, maybe a year or months. I can't even do the math right now. I just remember we were about to get into the car and you were on the porch and he was out in the driveway and he came to give me a hug goodbye. And when I held him, I started to cry. And it came out of nowhere because I didn't understand why I was feeling so emotional at the time. And I'm not saying, oh, it's because my spirit somehow knew that I wasn't going to see him again. I don't know. I'm not discounting that. But I just remember that was a great way to leave. A great memory to leave with. I grieve that I didn't know Steve the way his inner circle did. So that's a loss. That's a loss for me. But so to go back to your question, what is grief? That's what I think. It's the loss. It's dealing with the loss of that expectation that is now lost. That investment that is no longer going to be redeemable. I mean, in this life.
But how do you do that well? Because I think everybody feels that loss. But how do you how do you do that without it destroying you?
That's thank you for repeating your question. How do you do it well? That's the grand pause. How do you do it well is the grand pause. That's the you have to do it with resignation to God's will. You can't. There's no way for us to process all of the consequence, all of the meaning, and have and spend our time trying to derive meaning from it. If there isn't a plan, if there isn't a God, if He doesn't love us on some measure, in some way, that this experience is necessary. I think about eternity. How do we appreciate never losing somebody again? How do we appreciate eternity if we have never experienced personal loss, that that nugget's going to be with us forever? And if we don't appreciate that, then eternity with those people that we love again, like, what does that mean? Is it meaningless? I don't know. That's just something I wonder.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. Aaron, why don't you wrap it up for us and we'll call it a day.
I'm kind of with Jennifer. That since you told us before the podcast that one of the things you were going to ask is how do we grieve well, I have really struggled with that question. I've really thought hard about it, and it's actually pushed me to think of things in just ways I haven't really approached before. So I actually really appreciate the question. It's made me explore just thoughts and ideas and put them together, like a stack of Legos in a way that I haven't before. I also agree with Ben that I think the central component of grief is loss, especially unanticipated, unprepared for loss. But even loss that is anticipated or is prepared for can be terrible grief. And, when I think about, Steve's passing, I relate very well to my own griefs. I had a situation when I was living in Japan where I had powerful grief about realizing who I was versus who I wanted to be. I had powerful, almost overwhelming grief when Joyce lost her eyesight. I had grief when I found out that I had a chronic disease that I'd never get rid of in this life. I had terrible grief when I understood that one of my children was going to have a different life than what I wanted him to have. And so when Steve's passing happened, I was faced again, and I was very close to Steve. The last few years of his life, I had moved away, but, I had been his practice administrator for, 15 years or something like that. I saw him every day for 8 hours a day. I talked to him 2-3 times a night on the phone when he'd worry about stuff. And so I knew Steve really well. He was a deep part of the fabric of my life. And I remember, Ben mentioned the last time he saw Steve. The last time I talked to Steve, the last time I saw him was when we were having that family sibling chat on Mother's Day night, and he was standing behind you and just said hi to everybody, and he was gone 6 hours later. But the last time I talked to him was 3 days before that for about 3 hours, just about all of his concerns, health and the practice and all that. And I guess I'm vocalizing all this because your question, how do you grieve well, is not a question I've really thought of only in retrospect, because I've had to look back at Steve's passing and these other things that I've mentioned. And I think for me, and this is just for me, in all of these things that happen to us where we have this loss, this devastating loss that we just never saw it coming, and it hits us like a 2x4. I think grieving well means having that moment, because I like everything that everyone has said. I agree with all of it. I think grieving well, one component of grieving well means having that moment. Yes, you must feel and you must experience and you must almost embrace this pain. There's no other way to experience grief and loss. You can't love without pain. But I think grieving well means that you have a moment. You may still feel terrible. You may still not know, how does this end? But somehow you become ready to take your grief with you, but also say to yourself, I also need to live. Even though I grieve, I need to live. And with each of these experiences, Steve's death, Joyce's eyesight, there comes a moment, I think, in grieving well when you say, I'm not going to shut this chapter. This chapter will never shut. This has irrevocably changed my life. I will take this with me. But I have to live now. I have to not just grieve. I think you take that grief with you and you try to live. And that is hard, and it's step by step, and it's 2 steps forward and 1.5 back. But that, for me, is what grieving well is. It is fully feeling and fully embracing these terrible experiences that we've been given that are so hard, but also deciding at some point, I have to live. I'm going to take my grief with me. I'll never not have this grief with me. But I can grieve and live. I can grieve and love. I can grieve and have experiences in my life that I did not expect that are also really good. I can grieve and learn. And bundling those things together and allowing them to be bundled together, I think is a really important component of grieving well.
All right. Thanks for sharing that, you guys. And thanks again for being there for me. I love you guys. And
I love you too.
Love you.
All right. See you at the next barbecue. All right. Love you. Bye.
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 Bye.